Hello and welcome to the first installment of Slaying the Beast. In this series, we will be discussing well-known constructed Magic the Gathering decks and how to defeat them. Today we will be discussing a deck that has been in Magic existence for over a decade right now, and that deck is Affinity. If you aren't familiar with it, the deck is an artifact synergistic deck, which gets its name from the Affinity mechanic from the Mirrodin block. In Standard, this deck was so powerful that a handful of the cards in it had to be banned. After it left Standard, it saw very limited play in Legacy until the Scars of Mirrodin block came out in 2010, which introduced cards like Etched Champion. When Modern became a format, the deck's popularity skyrocketed, and it even made a top 4 showing at the first Modern Pro Tour. Since then, it is still very popular in both Modern and Legacy. Before we discuss what cards to use in this matchup, let's discuss some ground rules you should know when facing Affinity. The first thing you'll realize about playing against an Affinity player is on the first turn or so, they're going to be playing just about every card in their hand because every card in their deck usually costs around 0 to 1 mana. This might seem intimidating at first, but in all honesty, several of the 1 and 0 cost spells in the deck really are not that scary if you have a high life total. Most of them are just mana accelerants and 1 toughness, 1 power artifacts. Most of them are just there for synergistic purposes. The artifacts you should be concerned about are the Orcbound Ravager, which is the win-con creature of the deck, and Cranial Plating, which essentially turns any creature in play into a giant threat. Both of these cards showcase the deck's synergy incredibly well, and you have to be very, very cautious when playing against both of these cards. Other cards you probably should be concerned with are the Artifact Lords. There are 2 of them, the Steel Overseer, which will gradually make every little artifact they played on turn 1 bigger, and Master of Ethereum, which is a very large creature, but it pumps all the other artifacts as well. And also Etched Champion, which is essentially a very difficult thing to kill, and it's a very, very, very scary with a Cranial Plating attached to it. Considering an Affinity player can have a huge horde of artifact creatures, or 1 giant artifact creature equipped with a Cranial Plating as soon as turn 3, how on earth do we beat this? Well, if you play white, the most popular form of artifact hate is Stony Silence, which is excellent against Affinity because it stops Ravager from using its activated ability to sacrifice artifacts to give it more 1/1 counters, and it stops Cranial Plating from being equipped. However, because of its popularity, most Affinity decks are usually prepared for this. I'm not saying you shouldn't play it, it's a great sideboard card, just be prepared to have other answers. Speaking of other answers, white has other great artifact removal, like the classic Disenchant, but the thing is, although Disenchant can be good, if an opponent has a Ravager out, it can actually sacrifice any artifact in response to you disenchanting it and make the Ravager bigger. Because of this, it's usually a good idea to eliminate the Ravager first. That way, you get the biggest threat off the table. However, another problem here is once the Ravager is gone, it will transfer its counters over to another creature. This means that you essentially need to have 2 spot removal spells in order to get rid of the Ravager entirely. The first to get rid of the Ravager itself, and the second one to get rid of the creature transferred its counters to. Since Affinity is a very creature-heavy deck, white has several board wipes like the classic Wrath of God, which are actually quite devastating in most scenarios. However, you do have to be careful because even though all the creatures may be destroyed, Affinity players are known for using manlands like Inkmoth Nexus and Blinkmoth Nexus. So do keep those in mind and don't count those out because those can actually win the game for them right after you've wiped their board. Blue actually has quite a few answers to Affinity, even though blue does not particularly specialize in artifact removal. The most powerful of which is more than likely Hurkyl's Recall, which is essentially a 2-mana board wipe. As far as counterspells go, just about any counterspell is fine. You just have to counter the spells that really matter, like Cranial Plating, However, the most effective counterspell from my experience against Affinity, believe it or not, is Spell Snare. And the reason for this is just because everything in the Affinity deck that really matters the most costs 2 mana. Ravager costs 2 mana, Plating costs 2 mana, Steel Overseal costs 2 mana. The bottom line is you're going to counter something huge if you play Spell Snare against Affinity. Black has a ton of removal, but like I stated before, you have to be careful when you use it because 2-for-1ing yourself to get rid of a Ravager entirely isn't the most efficient thing. Head attack is not bad in the early game, but honestly, I would rather go with Inquisition of Kozilek because your life total matters, and everything costs under 3 mana. Thoughtseize isn't bad either, it's just your life total is going to matter. Like white, black has a ton of board wipes as well, but if anything, the most devastating of these, oddly enough, I would have to say is Curse of the Death's Hold. Most of Affinity's creatures have 1 toughness, and not very much power unless you have a cranial planing attached to them, so this is completely devastating. It gets rid of all the little artifacts, gets rid of the man lands when they activate them, and just does a whole lot of work for you. Red is also chock full of artifact hate. Considering red decks in Constructed are usually pretty fast, you are going to more than likely be in a race against the clock against Affinity. So therefore, depending on whether you're a fast red deck or a slow red deck, kind of determines what artifact hate you will be ultimately using. For a fast deck, I recommend Smash to Smithereens because if you're trying to end the game as quickly as possible, Smash is going to hit something big like a Cranial Plating and Lightning Bolt your opponent at the same time, and therefore applying more pressure. For a slower deck, I would actually recommend Vandal Blast, considering that you can use it immediately if you want, if you need to get rid of something in the early game, or later down the road when your opponent has an established board and you can just Shatterstorm all of his artifacts. Just a solid card against this matchup. If you splice green, you can try using Destructive Revelry instead of Smash the Smithereens. It's arguably a little bit worse, but it's actually better if you know your opponent is going to be siding a Blood Moon against you, because it can get rid of that as well. Speaking of green, green is kind of in the same boat when it comes to red. Like red, you're probably going to be playing a fairly fast deck if you're playing green, so you're going to be in a race against the clock. Green has a lot of good artifact removal, like Crowsand Grip, that can stop your opponent from making the Ravager any bigger or sacrificing the Ravager. When you're picking creatures to go up against Affinity, it's usually best that they follow what I've called the Rule of 5, and that's because Affinity's only real removal spell, or the most common at least, is Galvanic Blast, and that's what they use to get the final points of damage into you, or to do 4 damage to a creature. So it's really best that your finisher has at least 5 toughness. Although Shrapnel Blast is another option for them, I find Galvanic Blast is a lot more common. My favorite creature, or one of my favorite creatures, or that I would recommend, would be Siege Rhino, as it has 5 toughness, so it won't die to Galvanic Blast. It absorbs life from your opponent, so it puts your opponent at a disadvantage, puts you at an advantage, and it tramples over just about everything the Affinity player has. Keep in mind, just about anything will work, just make sure it goes into the synergy of your deck. Affinity really hates big creatures because everything they have is very small, and they usually have to burn resources in order to keep up with it. Another thing Affinity really hates is First Strike. If you like little things with First Strike, usually those creatures will have a big advantage because all Affinity's creatures are very small to start. And therefore, having something with First or Double Strike is very nice, especially against Cranial Plating when they only get a power boost. So with First Strike, that power boost may not always matter. Speaking of things that matter, your life total matters. Like I said before, the little artifact creatures like Memnite and Vault Scourge aren't that big of a deal, but later in the game, when you've got rid of all the big threats and you're down to a few life points, you have to be a little more conservative. Chances are your opponent's going to have a couple Galvanic Blasts in their hand, and they will likely finish you off. In short, try to keep your life total around 9 or so. That way, they need at least 2 Galvanic Blasts to finish you off. Usually, if an Affinity player is holding 1 card in their hand, that's likely going to be the Galvanic Blast that they were saving for your face. So try to get something big out there, try to get a way to disrupt that, maybe a counterspell. Like I say, hand attack can work in that situation, but they likely will use the Galvanic Blast in response, so you have to be careful there. Now, one thing that is recently becoming kind of a thing, or apparently it's starting to spread, is the use of the recently unbanned Thopter Foundry Sword of the Meat combo. Oddly enough, just about everything I've told you works against this combo as well. The things that don't always work against those decks, however, is, well, those decks actually use Tezzeret as well for card advantage. Against something like Tezzeret, if you feel like the Affinity player is kind of mixing it up, bring along a Pithing Needle. Pithing Needle is good against Planeswalkers, but it's also good against just about everything in Affinity. You can name Cranioplating, and they won't be able to equip the plating. It's a great versatile card. But in addition, if you're worried about the Affinity pulling a curveball on you, bring along some good versatile removal, like the classic Maelstrom Pulse, or even so the new one, Anguish Making. That's not bad either. You just have to be careful because your life total does matter. So now that you know what to do, and you're fairly certain that you're going to be playing against Affinity at your next sanctioned event, feel free to follow these strategies, and if you play your cards right, you will slay the beast. I hope this has been of some help to you. If there's a deck that you are having trouble beating, feel free to let me know about it in the comment section below, and I'll make an episode about how to beat that deck. Again, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and Galvanic Blast that subscribe button. My name is Spectre, and I'll see you next time.